The other thing that we saw him talking about from here was he was saying that, you know, sometimes those buttons, right, if you're going to another language, it might need to be wider. Like he was saying, like button was, well, it's 4 characters, but you go to French and it's another character, right? So a lot of times we can fix that just by doing what? Just doing wrap content. So a lot of times you can get around that just by setting the width or the height to wrap content instead. And that will make the button or whatever widget it needs to be wider if the text gets wider. If I use it on the height, then that also allows for like, oh, it needs to do wrapping, and so it can wrap to 3 lines instead of 2, right? So a lot of times you can fix that just by using wrap content. The other way you can do this is if you just set minimums. If I set a minimum width or a minimum height, instead of setting directly, it has to be this height or this or that, that allows me to still kind of get that approach in English, but then it can still be taller in whatever language, in whatever other language. So oftentimes you may want to use a minimum instead of strictly setting the width or height to whatever number you want to be. So I might say the height is wrap content, but the minimum height is 200. Similar thing with the height, similar thing with width, right? I could say this button needs to be at least 200 pixels wide, but this actual width is wrap content, so it could be bigger. Does that make sense? So a lot of times we can get around that with just those special keys. When I'm talking about placeholders, like I'm putting dynamic values in there, remember, we've kind of talked about that. It's going to be, we're going to use %s anytime you want to put in a string. %f would be putting in a floating point number. %d would be putting in a integer. And %t, remember, is a time or a date. Okay? So those are the kind of things that we're going to put into our format strings to handle those cases. We're going to say, here's something where we're going to drop in a piece of dynamic data, but the rest of it is dynamic. Also means one of the things you want to watch out for, something that I've seen a few people doing, and I would really not recommend, is we say, let's make a string builder. SB. I've seen a few things like this. Where there's a long string of appends, it's all okay as long as you're working in English, right? As soon as I try to go to another language, how many strings do I have here? I've got 4, right? So now when I go to translate, I've got 4 separate entities to hand to my translator and 4 separate entities that have to be in that XML file, right? I prefer this all to be one format string. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so that means I would prefer this to look something more Instead of doing that, I want to do append. Maybe I'll write it this way. If I do string, what I can do is context dot get string, and in there I can say, for instance, r dot string total, and pass in total like so. Right? If I call that get string and have it do the formatting, I can still append it. So I can still say sv dot append, or do that in one line if I need to. But anytime where you're combining tokens together, it's better to use this format instead, right? Don't have the string builder. Just if you've got change, you want to avoid that. Cool. String builder is good if you're like in a loop and I need to do something every iteration of the loop. It's great, but it's not good if you're going to do change like this. Okay. So what would my format string look like? Well, in this case. So in the XML, you're going to see, okay, my format string is total, in this resource, total, colon, $, and sometimes you may need to put a double $, to escape the $, because the $, has special meaning in there. So you may need to do $, %. That's a floating point number. So this would maybe something like 0.2 f dot, right? That would basically be the equivalent of what I'm doing here with those 4 appends. Does that make sense? So, not to say you shouldn't use string builders, it's just you shouldn't use string builders this way. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, because I have seen that in a few assignments, and that's going to make your work a lot harder for you, and in some places impossible if you keep going, if you're going down that route. So those are things you're going to have to swizzle over to context.getString using a format string instead of using all the appends. Okay? Talking about gender. You mentioned that depending on the culture you're in, it may be, the translation may depend on male or female. How do we solve that? You heard what he said. What did he say?
If your application's not catching it, asking for it, then you can't solve it.
Right, then you can't solve it. So what that means for us oftentimes in the registration process, we oftentimes have to use the, have to ask user their gender. And even cases where maybe they're not registering an account, we may have to ask that in first time setup. So say, hey, the first time we launch the app, let's go ask you your gender, and then we'll just save that somewhere on your device so that we have it to refer to later, right? So that means we need to ask them usually some sort of, possibly a dialogue, or in the registration process. And oftentimes we might save that as a preference. Kind of like you might say, hey, this is dark mode or light mode, might be in a preference. We haven't talked about how to use the shared preference system in Android, mainly because a lot of times just putting things in a database is a little bit more convenient and a little bit more general. But there is a way to store data locally on the device that's called shared preferences. Okay, so sometimes we might put that in there if we didn't have a database handy. Plurals. Android actually has a resource system for this. So there's actually plural resources. kind of like we can make, they're kind of similar to, we have string resources, there's plural resources. So there's a page I can kind of show you about what that is, but there's a system specifically for it in Android because it's enough of an issue. So there's actually a system for it. Oftentimes that means you have to kind of do the pluralization first and then put the finished plural into your format string. So say, hey, movies are movies, I'll go figure out what the proper plural is, and then I'll inject that as a %s somewhere in my string. So often a two-step process. Uppercase and lowercase. Short answer is you basically avoid it wherever you can. Because uppercase and lowercase doesn't work for a lot of languages, we just avoid it where we can. There's also some weird things with some variants of Russian where italic characters are special, especially when you uppercase and lowercase them. Italics in the lowercase version versus the uppercase version are not necessarily the same. So there's a lot of weird things that you get into, and the short answer is you just avoid calling those two methods as much as possible. Again, there are places where you can't get around it. There are places where sometimes, hey, this system doesn't support case-insensitive search, so you have to do it as a workaround. But that's something where we want to avoid it as much as we can. Make sense? So the short answer is just avoid it. Rely on your users to kind of make your code a little bit more general. What about the excerpt side of things, right? So he mentioned, with specifically with Arabic, the way the letters kind of words flow together, you can't really cut it in the middle, right? How do I solve that? Well, one option is I just never do excerpts. One option is to say, hey, I'm going to never do a short version of something. I'm never going to cut something at 50 characters. So I'm always going to show the whole thing, okay? And for certain cases, that is a must. That is actually how you have to solve it. So for instance, if I'm talking about text on buttons, you can't cut it. The thing has to be able to grow to as big as it needs to be, period. If that messes with your layout, you need to fix your layout. That's the long and short of it. So you need to allow for the thing or the label to be fairly long, because you don't have the flexibility to just say, hey, well, I'm going to trim it off and only show the first 50 pixels of this thing, right? That doesn't work. Okay, so that's one approach. It's just to say, hey, we're always going to do wrap content. We're not going to set max. We're not going to set explicit widths. We're going to let it grow as big as it needs to be. Okay. The other side of that is, let's say I have, in the case of, let's say in my movie list or my list of games, I do want to show a short blurb about that game or that movie in the list, right? How do I do that? If I say I can't chop it and just take the first 50 characters, how do I deal with an Arabic description of that game or movie?
Maybe make the text smaller. I don't know.
Well, maybe if I make the text smaller, there's at a certain point where I get into other problems, which is accessibility. Right? If I make the text too small, then some user can't read it. Okay. So that might be okay to bump it up or down, maybe at most about 2 dp. That's about the most flexibility you have, is about 2 dp, up or down. Other than that, it's too far, right? So that is one approach that we actually had to use for a few things, for a few languages, because of how we'd done our layouts. We made the mistake when we did our layouts where we put originally whoever made it had put the label on the left and the field on the right, and the only way we could get around that for some languages, we did have to bring the font size down. But that's really something you want to avoid, and it can only go so far. Does that make sense? So, all right, what else? Talking about excerpts here. One thing I could do, remember he said it's okay to chop it between words, but you can't chop it in the middle of a word, right? So one approach I could take is say, okay, rather than chopping it at 50, I'm going to start at character 50 and work my way back until I find the first space. I could do that, right? I could take your description, I could say, okay, let's go to character 50, iterate back from character 50 until I find a space, and then we'll chop it there. You could do that. You're dealing with Unicode though. Finding spaces is not always as easy as it might seem. Okay, so there's a little bit gotcha. There's another gotcha in the fact that in Unicode, there's not just one space characters. There's actually like 3 or 5 of them. There are a few characters that look exactly like a space, but are a different number, which is very, very weird, but such is the character set. So there's not just one character space. There's also tab in there too, you have to consider, because it basically is a space, right? So you can walk back till you find a first white space character, more generally, and say, okay, we'll cut it there, okay? But that means every time you want to show a blurb, you don't have to do that logic, right? Which more than likely that's going to be somewhere in your adapter, probably an on-bind view, which is already very busy and already needs to be very fast, right? So that's a lot of work to add on to the, oh, okay, as I'm scrolling down, it now has to dynamically figure these excerpts as I'm quickly scrolling through the recycler view. That's going to probably lead to some stutter, right? So what can I do? Well, easiest approach, figure out them ahead of time. Figure out your blurbs ahead of time and save them, which actually is what a lot of blogging platforms do. You just say, hey, we'll have, when you set up and you create this blog entry, here's the short blurb, the summary, and here's the whole article, right? So you say, maybe you store another field in the database that is the excerpt. Does that make sense? And that way you have the flexibility to say, hey, for Arabic, this is the excerpt. Because I'm limited to, say, 50 characters, I can then pick something and come up with something on a per article basis or a per item basis that makes sense. Does that follow? So oftentimes the way we do this, rather than just showing the first 50 characters, is we have another field in the database to do it. That would be usually how it's all done. Right to left. Again, this is a problem with Arabic and Hebrew. They're right to left languages. So usually what we do, good news is Unicode kind of deals with most of those things for you. So if you just put it into a text view, that text will basically work right to left. Same with an edit text. They already have support for those languages built in, which is awesome. But you still oftentimes will find yourself wanting to flip the language over. In Android, you'll see a lot of places where it says like start or end versus left or right. If you're saying left and right, it's always going to be left and right regardless of the language. If you say start and end swap in right to left languages. So if you say like margin start and margin end, then those swap. If you say align to parent, align to start, those alignments that we're putting in with the constraint layout, those are already going based on start and end. So a lot of times those things will just work as long as you make sure you're not accidentally setting padding as left or right or somewhere. It's worth mentioning that on older devices, namely somewhere around before 5.0, we actually historically didn't have start and end. And so if you're trying to target older devices, you end up needing to set both left and right for those older devices and start and end for newer devices. But because we set our minimum as 24, everything at 24 and above has for sure start and end, and so we haven't had to worry about that. Make sense? So those are things you have to watch about. Usually it's just, using start and end everywhere instead of using left and right. Okay. For dates, there's a lot of weird things in terms of dates. You just mentioned, the order of things. Is it day, month, year? Is it month, day, year? Or is it year, month, day? Or, there's at least 3 different variants that are common, and English is actually the rare one. What we use in America is very unusual. The good news is there's this class called date format, which will help you for most of those cases. So most of the cases, the way that we deal that, we just use the date format class, done. We tell it, I want this kind of date, I want a short date or I want a long date, I want a short time or a long time, and it will give us the correct format for whatever language and culture that your user's in. So a lot of times we can just use the date format class and problem solved. Same with times. Again, it would be the date format class. For numbers, it's similar. If you use number format already has a bunch of different rules built in, whether it be, for American, you say, hey, the thousand separator is a comma and the decimal point is a period, versus in Europe, it's actually usually backward, right? Where the dot is the thousand separator and the comma is the decimal point, as you might say. And it also deals with the Indian case of cros and lax. All of that stuff is built into number format. So generally speaking, anytime I want to show a number to the user, regardless of if it's an integer or a double, the right answer is usually to use the number format class, just as a general rule. It may not always to be. Currency is a weird one. Currency is one where you have to be a little bit more cautious, but in general, number format is what we use. Another thing to watch out for, both with numbers and date formats, oftentimes when we store these things in the database or whatever our persistence platform is, whether it's database or a file or whatever, we typically store those in a standardized format. We always store them in the same format, regardless of the user's particular culture. But when we present it always in their culture. So oftentimes the way that it's stored and the way that you show it is going to be in a different format, and you want to be aware of that. Make sense? So that comes up there. So that's a quick kind of overview of some of the things we'll be talking about and some of the things you need to be aware of in the ecosystem as a whole, right? It's more than just, hey, here I'm just going to translate these strings. Okay? So let's go ahead and take a break, and then I'm going to come back into the movie project and we'll start converting that one over to Spanish.